France arrived in Southeast Asia with grand ideas. It spoke of progress, faith, and enlightenment. It promised to bring modern civilization to lands it saw as backward and in need of guidance. This was the public face of its ambition, a noble mission to uplift and educate. The French called it the mission civilisatrice, or the civilizing mission. It was a powerful story, one that justified their presence thousands of miles from home. This narrative painted a picture of benevolent guardians sharing the fruits of European culture, science, and governance with the people of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. It was an image crafted for audiences back in Paris and, for the international community. However, beneath this polished surface lay a different set of motivations. These were the unstated but far more powerful drivers of empire: profit, power, and prestige. France was not just in Asia to build schools and hospitals. It was there to compete with its great rival, Great Britain, which already had a vast and wealthy empire. French leaders looked at British India and honestly felt a deep sense of national envy. They believed that for France to be a truly great world power, it needed its own colonial jewel in the East. Indochina was meant to be that prize, a source of raw materials, new markets, and strategic advantage. This created a deep and lasting contradiction. The empire was built on a foundation of conflicting goals. On one hand, there was the genuine belief among some administrators, missionaries, and teachers that they were doing good work. They saw themselves as bringing order, modern medicine, and education to the region. They designed cities, built railways, and established legal systems based on French models. They truly thought they were improving lives and guiding these societies toward a better future. This sincere, if paternalistic belief, was a real part of the colonial experience for the colonizers. Yet, this ideal of a civilizing mission was constantly undermined by the harsh reality of colonial economics and politics. The pursuit of wealth often led to brutal exploitation. The desire for absolute control resulted in the suppression of local traditions and political freedoms. The high-minded talk of partnership and progress rang hollow for the millions of farmers who lost their land, or the workers who toiled on rubber plantations in terrible conditions. This fundamental conflict between the stated ideal and the practical reality of rule would define the entire history of French Indochina, creating a legacy of both development and deep-seated resentment. The story of French Indochina cannot be understood without looking at the intense rivalry between France and Great Britain. For centuries, these two European powers had been locked in a struggle for dominance. This competition played out on battlefields in Europe, on the high seas, and across the globe, in a race for colonial territories. By the 19th century, Britain had established a powerful and hugely profitable empire, with India as its most prized possession. The sheer scale and wealth of British India cast a long shadow, making French leaders anxious about their nation's standing on the world stage. They felt France was falling behind. Vietnam, then known to Europeans as Annam or Cochinchina, became a focus for French ambitions for several reasons. Geographically, it was strategically positioned. It had a long coastline, major rivers like the Mekong, and offered a potential gateway into the vast, untapped markets of southern China. French explorers and merchants dreamed of using the Mekong River as a highway for trade, a French-controlled alternative to the British-dominated ports of Canton and Hong Kong. Control of Vietnam would not only provide resources, but would also give France a crucial strategic foothold in a region where British influence was rapidly expanding from its bases in India and Malaya. Economic motives were just as powerful as strategic ones. The Industrial Revolution in France had created a huge demand for raw materials like rubber, coal, and tin, all of which could be found in Southeast Asia. At the same time, French factories were producing more goods than could be sold at home, creating a need for new, captive markets. A colony like Vietnam would be forced to buy French products and supply cheap raw materials in return. Christian missionaries also played a key role. French Catholic priests had been active in Vietnam for decades, and their occasional persecution by Vietnamese emperors provided a convenient pretext for military intervention, framed as a noble cause to protect the faith. This combination of national pride, strategic calculation, economic hunger, and religious zeal pushed France toward intervention. The initial steps were small, often led by ambitious naval officers and missionaries acting on their own initiative. But these small actions gradually drew the French state deeper into the region. A naval attack here, a treaty signed under duress there, Each step made a full-scale colonial project more likely. What began as a vague ambition to counter British power slowly solidified into a concrete plan for conquest. Vietnam was the key, the first and most important piece in the puzzle of what would become French Indochina. The creation of French Indochina was not a single event but a gradual and often violent process that unfolded over several decades. France did not conquer a unified territory, it pieced its empire together region by region, using a mix of military force, political maneuvering and treaties that were heavily weighted in its favor. The process began in earnest in 1858 when a French fleet attacked the port of Da Nang in central Vietnam. The initial goal was to punish the Vietnamese court for its anti-Christian policies, but it quickly escalated into a war of conquest. By 1862, France had forced the emperor to cede 3 southern provinces, which became the French colony of Cochinchina. This southern region, with its fertile Mekong Delta and the bustling port of Saigon, became the heart of the French enterprise. Unlike other parts of Indochina, Cochinchina was ruled directly as a colony. This meant French law was imposed, French officials held all key positions, and the region was fully integrated into the French economic system. From this secure base, the French pushed northwards. In the 1880s they launched another military campaign, this time targeting the northern and central parts of Vietnam, known as Tonkin and Annam. After fierce fighting, the Vietnamese court was forced to accept French authority, turning these regions into protectorates. While Vietnam was the main prize, French ambition did not stop there. To the west lay the ancient kingdom of Cambodia, which was weak and caught between its more powerful neighbors, Siam, modern Thailand, and Vietnam. Seeing an opportunity, France offered the Cambodian king protection. In 1863, the king signed a treaty that effectively turned his country into a French protectorate. A few decades later, in 1893, France used a similar tactic with Laos. It provoked a border dispute with Siam and sent gunboats up the Chao Phraya River to Bangkok, forcing the Siamese to give up their claims to the territories east of the Mekong River. These lands were then consolidated into the French protectorate of Laos. By the turn of the 20th century, the patchwork was complete. French Indochina was officially formed, a union of 5 distinct territories. It included the colony of Cochinchina, southern Vietnam, the protectorates of Annam, central Vietnam, and Tonkin, northern Vietnam, the protectorate of Cambodia, and the protectorate of Laos. In theory, the protectorates kept their local rulers, the emperor in Vietnam, and the kings in Cambodia and Laos. In reality, these monarchs were little more than figureheads. All real power rested with the French governor-general in Hanoi, who ruled over the entire union. This complex political arrangement allowed France to control a vast and diverse region under a single centralized administration. The mission civilisatrice, or civilizing mission, was the moral and intellectual justification for French colonialism. It was an idea born from the confidence of 19th-century Europe, a belief in the universal superiority of its own culture, science, and political systems. According to this worldview, France had a duty to share its enlightenment with the less developed peoples of the world. In Indochina, this translated into a promise to bring progress. French officials, teachers, and doctors saw themselves as agents of positive change. They planned to build a modern society by introducing rational administration, scientific knowledge, and the French language, which they considered the language of universal culture. This mission was not entirely insincere. Some colonial administrators genuinely dedicated their lives to what they saw as public service. They established schools that taught a French curriculum, hoping to create a small, educated local elite that could help run the colony. They built hospitals and introduced Western medicine to combat diseases like malaria and cholera, leading to real improvements in public health in urban centers. They codified laws and created court systems based on French models, believing they were replacing arbitrary local justice with a more rational and predictable legal framework. In their minds, they were lifting the people of Indochina out of poverty, superstition, and despotism. However, the noble rhetoric of the civilizing mission often served as a convenient mask for the much harsher realities of economic exploitation and political domination. While France talked about partnership, its primary goal was to make the colony profitable for the motherland. The civilizing efforts were highly selective and designed to serve French interests. Education was limited, creating just enough clerks, interpreters, and low-level officials to run the colonial bureaucracy, but not enough to foster a large, independent intellectual class that might challenge French rule. The system was designed to produce loyal assistants, not equal partners. Ultimately, the civilizing mission was deeply paternalistic and racist. It was based on the assumption that the local cultures of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos were inherently inferior and needed to be replaced or corrected by French culture. Traditional social structures, religious beliefs, and educational systems were dismissed as archaic. This created a profound cultural clash and a deep sense of humiliation among the local population. The promise of being civilized came with the implicit condition of becoming more French and less Vietnamese, Cambodian, or Lao. For many, this was not a gift but an assault on their identity, making the mission a source of resentment rather than gratitude. Under French rule, Indochina underwent a dramatic economic transformation. The French were determined to integrate the colony into the global economy, but on their own terms. Their main goal was to extract valuable resources and create a captive market for French goods. To achieve this, they invested heavily in infrastructure. But these projects were designed to serve the colonial economy, not the needs of the local population. A vast network of railways was built, but the lines were laid to connect resource-rich areas, such as coal mines in the north and rubber plantations in the south, to the main ports of Saigon and Haiphong for export. The most significant changes occurred in agriculture. The French saw the immense potential of the Mekong and Red River deltas for rice cultivation. They drained swamps and expanded irrigation networks, opening up huge new areas for farming. However, this land did not go to the local peasants. Instead, it was sold in large plots to French companies or wealthy Vietnamese collaborators, creating a new class of powerful landlords. Small farmers were often forced into tenancy or became landless laborers, trapped in a cycle of debt. At the same time, the French introduced new cash crops, most notably rubber. Huge plantations were established, often on land cleared from forests, to feed the booming automobile industry in Europe and America. Mining was another key sector of the colonial economy. Northern Vietnam, or Tonkin, was rich in coal, tin, and zinc. French companies were granted monopolies to exploit these resources. They opened large mines, such as the massive coal mine at Hon Gai, where thousands of Vietnamese laborers worked in grueling and dangerous conditions for very low wages. These raw materials were not used to build local industries. They were shipped directly to France. The entire economic system was structured as a one-way street. Raw materials flowed out of Indochina, and finished French products, such as textiles and wine, flowed in, protected from competition by high tariffs. The beneficiaries of this economic system were clear. French corporations, investors, and colonial officials made immense fortunes. A small westernized elite of Vietnamese, Cambodian, and Lao landlords, merchants, and civil servants also prospered by collaborating with the French. But for the vast majority of the population, the economic transformation brought hardship. Peasants lost their land, artisans were put out of business by imported French goods, and workers endured brutal exploitation on plantations and in mines. The modern infrastructure that the French built, the railways, roads, and ports, was a constant visible reminder of an economy designed for the benefit of the colonizers, not the colonized. Nowhere was the French vision for Indochina more apparent than in its cities. The French transformed existing urban centers and built new ones, imposing their own ideas of order, hygiene, and beauty. Hanoi became the administrative capital of the Indochinese Union, with grand government buildings and wide, tree-lined boulevards. But it was Saigon, the capital of the directly ruled colony of Cochinchina, that became the ultimate symbol of the French presence. French planners set out to turn this bustling Vietnamese port into a grand European city, a jewel of the empire that would rival British Singapore or Hong Kong. They envisioned it as a showcase of French culture and power in the heart of Asia. They laid out a new city grid, with broad avenues radiating out from a central point, reminiscent of Baron Haussmann's redesign of Paris. They built magnificent public buildings in the latest French architectural styles. The Saigon Opera House was a flamboyant copy of the Petit Palais in Paris. The Notre Dame Cathedral, built with materials imported entirely from France, could have been plucked from a French provincial town. The central post office, with its soaring iron and glass roof, was designed by Gustave Eiffel's firm. These structures were intended to be more than just functional. They were powerful statements of French cultural dominance and permanence. Life in these new urban spaces was sharply segregated. The French and a small number of wealthy Vietnamese lived in elegant villas along the tree-lined boulevards, enjoying a lifestyle filled with French cafes, exclusive social clubs, and Western entertainment. They strolled along the Rue Catinat, Saigon's fashionable shopping street, which was lined with chic boutiques and department stores, selling the latest goods from Paris. For this colonial elite, Saigon truly was the Pearl of the Orient, a comfortable and glamorous outpost of European civilization where they could replicate the life they had left behind in France. This Europeanized city, however, was only one part of the story. The majority of the Vietnamese population lived in separate, crowded neighborhoods, often in squalid conditions. They were the rickshaw pullers, the servants, the dock workers, and the small-scale merchants who provided the labor that kept the colonial city running. For them, the grand buildings and wide avenues were symbols not of progress, but of their own exclusion. The city was a physical representation of the colonial hierarchy. While the French built a beautiful facade, behind it lay a society deeply divided along lines of race and class, a division that was nowhere more visible than in the streets of Saigon itself. The legacy of French rule in Indochina is deeply mixed, a complex tapestry of modernization woven with threads of inequality. On one side, the French did introduce tangible elements of progress. The establishment of hospitals and public health programs, particularly in cities, helped to control epidemics and improve sanitation. The introduction of the Romanized script for the Vietnamese language, known as Quoc Ngu, simplified literacy and eventually became a powerful tool for mass communication and national identity. The construction of roads, bridges, and railways connected distant regions, fostering a greater sense of a unified territory, even if it was under foreign control. However, these benefits came at a tremendous cost and were distributed unevenly. The new infrastructure was paid for by heavy taxes levied on the local population, especially the peasants. They faced taxes on their land, on their heads, and even on basic necessities, like salt, alcohol, and opium, for which the colonial government held profitable monopolies. Many farmers, unable to pay these taxes, lost their ancestral lands and were forced into tenancy or wage labor. The modern healthcare and education that the French introduced were largely confined to the cities and primarily served the French and the small, loyal local elite. In the countryside, where the vast majority of people lived, life changed very little, except for the increased economic burden. French rule also caused profound cultural and social disruption. The colonial administration deliberately undermined traditional village autonomy and the authority of local elders and scholars who had been the backbone of Vietnamese society for centuries. The Confucian-based civil service examination system, which had been the path to social mobility for centuries, was abolished and replaced with a French-style education system. This created a cultural vacuum and a sense of dislocation. A new generation grew up caught between two worlds: the traditional world of their parents, which was now devalued, and the French world, to which they could never fully belong. This created a society starkly divided along multiple lines. There was the division between the French colonizers and the colonized masses. There was a growing gap between the city and the countryside. And there was a new division within Indo-Chinese society itself, between the small westernized elite who benefited from French rule and the vast majority who suffered under it. This inequality was not an accidental byproduct of colonialism. It was fundamental to the system. The entire structure was designed to maintain a strict hierarchy, with the French at the top, and this inherent injustice would ultimately fuel the desire for radical change. French domination, despite its overwhelming military and administrative power, was never met with passive acceptance. From the very beginning, there was resistance. In the early years, this resistance was led by members of the old royal court and Confucian scholars who sought to expel the foreigners and restore the old order. These early movements, like the Can Vuong, meaning aid the king movement, were traditional in nature and, while courageous, were ultimately crushed by superior French firepower. They lacked the modern organization and ideology needed to challenge a powerful colonial state. As the 20th century began, the nature of resistance started to change. A new generation of nationalists emerged, inspired by new ideas from China, Japan, and the West itself. Figures like Fanboy Chow and Fan Chu Trin looked to Japan's modernization as a model, or to the Western ideals of liberty and self-determination that the French themselves championed in theory. They argued that Vietnam needed to modernize not by becoming French, but by developing its own strength to reclaim its independence. They established secret societies, published clandestine newspapers, and sent students abroad to learn modern science and politics. They began to imagine a new kind of nation, a modern Vietnam free from foreign rule. The most significant development was the rise of communism. A young nationalist named Nguyen Ai Quoc, who would later become known as Ho Chi Minh, traveled the world in search of a path to liberation. In Paris, he was drawn to the anti-colonial message of the Communist International. He saw in Marxism-Leninism not only a powerful critique of capitalist exploitation, but also a practical strategy for organizing a mass-based revolutionary movement. He believed it offered the most effective way to unite peasants, workers, and intellectuals in a common struggle for both national independence and social justice. He founded the Indochinese Communist Party in 1930, providing a disciplined and determined organization that would come to dominate the nationalist movement. The policies of the French colonial state inadvertently helped fuel these movements. The economic hardship faced by peasants and workers created a large and desperate population ready to listen to revolutionary ideas. The limited education system created a class of frustrated intellectuals who were denied real opportunities and felt alienated from both traditional and colonial society. The political repression, which included imprisonment and execution of nationalists, only created martyrs and hardened the resolve of the survivors. By suppressing moderate nationalist voices, the French left radical movements like the Communists as the most viable option for those seeking liberation. In this way, French rule itself planted the seeds of its own destruction. The end of French Indochina in 1954, following the disastrous military defeat at Dien Bien Phu, did not end the story. The legacy of nearly a century of colonial rule continued to shape the destinies of Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos in profound and often tragic ways. The arbitrary borders drawn by the French created nations that contained diverse ethnic groups, leading to future internal tensions. The political vacuum left by the French departure was not filled with peace and stability, but by decades of brutal conflict. The First Indochina War against the French was immediately followed by the Second Indochina War, known in the West as the Vietnam War, where the United States stepped in to try and contain the spread of communism. In Vietnam, the division of the country into a communist North and an anti-communist South was a direct consequence of the colonial struggle. The war that followed was, in many ways, a continuation of the fight for full independence and unification that began under the French. In Cambodia, the destabilization caused by the Vietnam War allowed the genocidal Khmer Rouge, a radical communist movement with its own roots in the anti-colonial struggle, to seize power with devastating consequences. Laos also endured years of civil war, becoming the most heavily bombed country per capita in history as it was drawn into the larger regional conflict. The end of empire did not bring liberation but a new, more horrifying chapter of violence. Yet alongside this legacy of conflict, other echoes of the French era remain. The Romanized Quoc Ngu script, once a tool of the colonizers, is now the universal and unifying script of Vietnam. The architectural style of cities like Hanoi, Saigon, now Ho Chi Minh City, and Phnom Penh still bears a strong French imprint, with colonial-era villas and public buildings standing as historical landmarks. French cuisine has left its mark on the local food, with the banh mi sandwich and Vietnamese coffee being popular examples of this cultural fusion. The French language, while no longer dominant, is still spoken by some older generations and taught in schools, a reminder of a complex shared history. Today, on October 20th, 2025, the nations of former Indochina are independent and looking toward the future. They have largely overcome the devastation of the 20th century and are experiencing rapid economic growth. However, the shadow of the colonial past is long. The political systems, the national identities, and the very shape of these countries were forged in the crucible of French ambition and the long struggle against it. The story of French Indochina serves as a powerful reminder of how the pursuit of empire, driven by a mix of greed, rivalry, and a flawed sense of mission can leave deep and lasting scars on the world, scars that take many generations to heal.